pleased to have this particular panel discussion. Panel discussions are always really interesting. We didn't do any last year. They take a certain amount of coordination. And I really want to thank our participants here because they really jumped in and have collaborated together and have made themselves, in their very, very busy schedules, made themselves available to come and tell you about the UN in Qatar. Like, what is the United Nations presence here in this country? What are these organizations doing? And certainly we have time for some Q&A, so I'm going to want to talk to admin and make sure we have a mic and have an opportunity also for you to ask questions. I'm sure some of you envision yourself working for the United Nations and maybe even here in this country someday. So hopefully the panelists are here to inspire. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and have a great session. We're really thrilled to have you all here, and I appreciate the time that you've taken to be here for us. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jenna Dawson-Faber, and I am here in Doha working for the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. I'm actually here in the capacity as the Regional Anti-Corruption Advisor for the Gulf, and I'm going to start off the presentations after my dear colleagues here introduce themselves.
My name is Anna Paolini. I'm the Director of the Regional Office for UNESCO based here in Doha. We cover the GCC and Yemen.
Good afternoon. My name is George Abuzulov. I am the head of the UN Training Center, UN Training and Documentation Center for Southwest Asia and the Arab region, which is based here in Doha. And I'll give more details when we do our presentation.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Margaret Zimmerman, and I work for Dr. Ahmed Al-Murayhi, who is the UN Secretary General's humanitarian envoy, and he and I are based here in Qatar.
Okay, so lucky me gets to start off the presentation. So as I said, I work for the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. So yes, we focus on drugs and crime and the prevention of terrorism as well. So one of the major topics that we focus on here in Qatar is something called the Arab Initiative to Counter Human Trafficking. And this is something that we're doing across the entire Arab region. And a lot of it focuses on capacity building and training and helping the countries network amongst themselves to combat what is truly a regional problem. Associated with a lot of the trafficking patterns is things like drug trafficking, wildlife trafficking, and something that Anna and I share in common is looking at the trafficking in cultural property as well. And this particular region, Qatar included, is a fairly well-known hub for a lot of the transiting of these illegal goods. And we spend a lot of our time helping out with border control. We do a lot of work specifically on container control, which are the big boxes that you see transporting things all over the place. We also have a really interesting program on basically air cargo. So we've got the same people who are working on multiple borders. So we've got land, air, and sea borders that we're working on. And we're focusing on a lot of things like, what do you look for? Right? How can you tell? When should you open a container? What's the risk profile? How do you decide when it's time to actually dig a little bit deeper? Because there's so much container traffic that it would take you ages to open them all up. So we spend a lot of time doing risk management. I think probably one of the most interesting things that we have going on here in Qatar is the partnership we have with something called the Gulf Information Center for Drugs. And we're working really closely with them. It's basically an intelligence center that helps the GCC countries share information amongst each other, and they're looking both at drug supply as well as drug demand. So it's actually kind of an interesting little center, and I'd be happy to talk to you a little bit more about some of those things. And finally, I think I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking about my area of expertise, which is anti-corruption. So I'm here, and I do work for the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and I'm sitting in Doha with something called the Rule of Law and Anti-Corruption Center. It's a private center that has a public benefit in that we work with not only Qataris, but we work across the GCC region in trying to assist governments and universities and NGOs in their fight against corruption. So something that's really close to my heart is something called the Anti-Corruption Academic Initiative. And we're helping universities, especially here in Qatar, actually put anti-corruption programming into their curriculum. So whether you go to law school or business school or any of the other programs, if you study political science, there's probably, hopefully, going to be a section on anti-corruption that we could talk to you a little bit about. So UNODC is the guardian of the UN Convention Against Corruption. And this is an almost universal convention, and it's the first and only legally binding document, which means when countries sign up to this convention, that they are actually treaty bound to implement it. So there's 4 main chapters that focus on substance, so things like the prevention of corruption. We've also got a chapter on law enforcement and criminalization, one on international cooperation, and one on asset recovery. And the Rule of Law Center, where I sit, is actually specialized in helping with asset recovery. We have a few experts on staff who work to return the proceeds of corruption to the countries from which they were stolen. Something else that's kind of interesting here is we are the secretariat for the International Association for Anti-Corruption Authorities. And we affectionately really do call it IACA, because there's 2 A's in the middle. And it's basically the organization that brings together all of the governmental anti-corruption authorities to support the implementation of the UN Convention. So it sounds a little bit dry. I'm sure some of you are like, anti-corruption. But a lot of the stuff that we do is actually really interesting because we focus a lot on things like integrity and the rule of law. And these are really important concepts that really hit home to a lot of the work that all 4 of us do. And I think something that we'll probably all talk a little bit about is the fact that we spend a lot of our time here in Qatar focusing on education initiatives and a lot of things in terms of prevention. So I think that'll be the common thread that we use to talk a little bit about the rest of our work here. So, George, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Okay, then, good afternoon again, and I'm very happy to be with you today. I hope my presentation will be very useful. You know, our name, as you can see, is very long. United Nations Human Rights Training and Documentation Center for Southeast Asia and the Arab region. And actually, this center was established in 2009 in Doha after a General Assembly resolution. So it has a very strong mandate because it was established through the UN General Assembly. And thanks to the State of Qatar because they offered to host the center here in Qatar, but of course, as you will see now, the center covers many other countries in the region. But in order to make our discussion more interactive, I have a question to all. Why do you think we need a human rights training and education? Do you think it is needed in the region, and why? Yes, please. Do you have a mic?
I think it's important for people to know their rights so that they're not abused by others. Because if you know what's for you and what's against you, you can apply that to your life to live better. It's also to teach you how to treat other people. So that's why we need human rights training and education.
Perfect, thank you very much. Any other intervention? Yes. Please go ahead.
It's so like a lot of people don't know about human rights nowadays, so to get more people educated and trained about it would be a better thing to do for everyone and for the benefit of a lot of people who don't know about it.
Is there anybody who would like to say, what is the difference between human rights training and education? Why training and why education? And education to whom? Any other contribution?
I presume that human rights education means just knowing what your right is, like it's your right this and that. But human rights training is to show you how to use these rights to your benefit and how these rights give you a path on how to treat people.
Maybe training, we train professionals in different areas, like we train police officers on how to respect human rights while doing their own duties. We train judges on how to enforce rule of law and fair trial rights in the courts. We train lawyers, we train my colleague from the UNODC mentioned about their program on combating human trafficking. So it's important to train the police on the international standards on protecting the victims of human trafficking, etc. While human rights education is for all, from kids in the primary school, even preschool education, secondary school, universities, and at all levels. Anyway, that's fine, but sorry. Yeah. So the key purpose, why do we have a center for the United Nations providing training and education? We want to promote the values and principles of human rights and to ensure the respect for these rights. This is the key. And when we talk about human rights, we talk about values, we talk about principles, that we need those to be known, and people, and especially those who are expected to implement these rights or to fulfill these rights, that they respect them. So that's why we build knowledge, we raise public awareness, and we disseminate the human rights culture among all. Now, we do this through educational programs, conferences, seminars, training activities, technical support to partners, and we work with civil society organizations, with governments, as well as national human rights institutions in the region. And here are the countries that we cover through the center. You can see we cover 25 countries, 22 Arab countries, as well as 3 Southeast Asian countries, Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Sorry, I'm not good at technology. Anyway, the methodologies that we use, usually we try to build effective partnerships with civil society, as I mentioned, national human rights institutions, with governments in the region. We build networks among them, like for example, we have a network of women human rights defenders, and we use a participatory approach in our training and promotion methodology. Our source of funding as a center, it comes mainly from the UN regular budget in New York. We have, we are under the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, so our office in Geneva provides also extra from its extra budgetary resources, some funding for us, and we have some earmarked funding that comes from specific donors, like a project we implemented in some countries affected by the conflict in the region that was funded by Qatar Foundation. We also do some work on human trafficking. So I'll present to you some of our activities like in the last period. This is in the United Arab Emirates, and it's how to integrate the legislations related to combating human trafficking with national human rights institutions. You can see here the event that we organized this year on, this was on the World Press Freedom Day that we organized also with UNESCO. We do some work on human rights and diplomacy, mainly we target ministries of foreign affairs. We do also on human rights-based approach to media coverage. And here are some of our activities in Morocco. And as you can notice, we don't organize our activities just in Qatar. We do it in partnership with partners all over the region that we cover. So we did in Bangkok, and in UAE, in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Jordan, this one in Morocco. And in our work on the human rights education, you can see here our work. This was a workshop in Jordan on the protection of the right to education during the conflict that was organized in Jordan. We do also some work on minorities in the region. And here are some of our activities and the recent workshop we organized in Tunisia on the human rights of minorities in the region. We do some work on economic, social, cultural rights like health, education, adequate standard of living, etc. This is what we mean by economic, social, culture. This workshop was how to monitor the implementation on the respect or the fulfillment of economic, social, and cultural rights. This is very quickly, you see this chart represents the participants of our activities from all over the 25 targeted countries between 2015 and 2017. This is the gender. Unfortunately, we still have more males dominating activities, but we hope we can achieve gender balance in the near future. We try always to push more female participation. And that's it. If you have any question, I'll be more than happy to answer. And thank you very much.
Thanks, George. Anna, should take over?
Sure. So hi again, and welcome to this panel debate. I would like to know how many of you knows actually what UNESCO stands for, especially the E, S, and C in our acronym. But UNESCO is one of the specialized agencies. It covers education, science, and the S stands also for social sciences, and C as culture. Like many of the specialized agencies and United Nations agencies, it was established after the Second World War. And our motto, our vision is all around building peace in the mind of women and men through our field of competence, education, science, and culture in particular. So we are the only UN agency dealing with culture and cultural heritage and intangible heritage and all the different aspects of culture. And the only one that look at education from early childhood until adult education, going through, of course, secondary higher education, but also issues about literacy, adult literacy, and lifelong learning for adults. We deal also with science, and science that are natural sciences and social sciences. And not least, it is not in our acronym, but information and media, and also ICT. So it's quite a broad range of topics, and that I always used to say that we are not that specialized if you think about it. Virtually, it's an extensive mandate, and that's why it's also extremely interesting and extremely motivating. Because if I must say, during a day at the office, I can cover issues from intangible heritage going through, education, inclusive education, for example, for minorities or people with disability or people of language minorities and others, ending up dealing with sports, because we have a convention that covers anti-dopings in sports, and I can end up talking about freedom of expression. So you can see it's quite a broad mandate that we have. Of course, we don't do or cover all of the topics of the organization here in the country. As I said before, my office covers 7 countries, all the GCC and Yemen. And you can imagine it's quite a different portfolio. From one side, you have the GCC, which is our very high GDP countries, very rich country in the world, and at the same time, I cover Yemen, which is presently, very unfortunately, a country at war, which has enormous needs in all senses, not only in humanitarian help to face the crisis, the cholera that we are having at the moment, the lack of infrastructures, the lack of public health, the difficulties of accessing schools, but also we are looking at the early phases of development for the country, so that the people start running, a normal life, and they don't feel that they are confined in a very difficult situation for a long period of time. So I would like to go a little bit more in detail of actually what is our portfolio here at the office for the country where we stay. Maybe you ask yourself, where are we in Doha, if you are familiar with the countries? Well, both George and myself are set in 2 villas, and if you go into the tunnel going from here toward West Bay, the new tunnel after the Qatar roundabout, you will see 2 blue flags right on your right before entering the tunnel. So we are there, and UNESCO has been present in this country since '77, so we are not newly established. We started as a small program office, especially to help in the country to establish their education system, but then we were generously hosted here as a regional office. And in 2006, also Yemen was added as geographical coverage for our office. We here in Doha have, for the country in particular, have also quite interesting portfolio. For culture, for example, as you might know, since we cover in the field of culture several conventions, in particular 5 conventions for the protection of cultural heritage, and name it very quickly. It might sound a bit odd to you, but we cover what we call the 1954 Convention, because it was entered into force in that year, and it has to deal with the protection of cultural heritage in time of armed conflict. We also have a convention for the protection of heritage, illicit traffic in heritage, and we call it 1970 Convention. We have the most popular, that probably could sound familiar to you, the 1972 Convention, which is the World Heritage Convention. And here we have one site that has been inscribed in 2014, and which is the Zubara archaeological sites, and not only the fort. There is a huge archaeological site behind it. That's the value part of the sites. We have the 2001 Convention that has to deal with underwater cultural heritage, yes, because we don't look only at heritage on the ground, but we also look at what is underwater, you know, all the vessels that have been sunk and so on, and there are several also in the Gulf. And then the 2005 convention, that is the Convention for Cultural Diversity. So, yet the Qatar is signatory of almost all the convention except the 2001, that is the one for underwater cultural heritage. And of course, we do help the country to make sure that they not only ratify the convention, but actually they put into practice the convention. For example, concerning the site of Zubara, that is under the 72 convention, we help them in preparing their management plan. This is a mandatory thing for the conservation of cultural heritage. When one country actually ratifies the convention and has one of the their cultural heritage sites inscribed. So also here in Qatar we have QM, Qatar Museums, is in charge of the site of Zubara. We had also last year a very successful program together that was the youth volunteer for world heritage. So we had about 50 young persons like you that had already interest and specialization in cultural heritage, that they come over. They were half Qatari and half foreigner from all over the world, that came here and were hosted by the Qatar Museum for 1 month in Zubara to do some activities like excavation and conservation of cultural heritage. So the site is quite unique, and its inscription is due for its outstanding universal value. That's how the sites are pinpointed in this list. And Zubara is a unique example of coastal cities, that merchant cities that were used for a number of years to commerce pearls, in this case, in this area. It has a particular way of being built with coral stone, and it served the purpose and the link from the east to the west along the various routes, especially the sea routes, to trade pearls. So we are helping the Qatar Museum in this sense. We are also working on illicit traffic. You have heard Jenna that mentioned that, because we have very close ties with UNODC for the trafficking of cultural artifacts. As she mentioned, the Gulf is a hub for transition. For transiting of these pieces, for example, from Central Asia or Afghanistan or even Syria and Iraq. You know, during a period of war, it's easier to have access and to have illicit excavation, and so all these objects pass through different routes. Some pass through here because we have ports that are duty-free zones, and then they move usually either to Europe or directly to the US. So what we are doing, we are actually training, especially the officials, and we do that whether at national level but also at regional level, on what are their duty to make sure that the convention is actually put in place. But at the same time, we train border patrol of custom department, for example, on how to detect, how to recognize a false from a true, for example, vessels coming from Iraq. There are several techniques, and then we also, together with Interpol, manage a list of stolen artifacts, so that different custom and police have access, so that they can recognize and track if the artifacts they have spotted at their border can correspond to this stolen artifact database. Here we also work on cultural diversity. You might have seen last year, and also this year, it's going on at the moment, there is a festival of cultural diversity going on in Qatar. We were able to bring together about 20 countries every year to perform their traditional dances, folklore or singing. And in particular, the ones that are inscribed on the list of UNESCO intangible heritage elements, like for example, Argentinian tango, or Spanish flamenco. So these are important elements that are protected by the convention that I had mentioned before, that I inscribe to the list of UNESCO intangible heritage elements. We work also on cultural heritage education. In your curricula you have a lot of references, of course, to heritage. So I'm sure you learn a lot about what's going on, what the world has to offer. Different world heritage sites, ancient civilization, and so on. But what we are interested here is especially to let the young people, as you, what is actually the heritage in their own countries. And sometimes curricula had very little reference to that. And I always say that we have to start to know what we have in our backyard before expanding the horizon of what we have outside. So we have worked on this also with the Ministry of Education. In terms of education, which is the pillar of UNESCO, I would say, and education is at the basis of everything. A good education gives people the possibility to have a good job, a good employment, a good livelihood. So here, of course, access to education, it means going to school is not a problem, like it could be in many other developing countries in Africa or in other Arab countries that are not so lucky as Qatar is. So we are not working on this, but we are working more on improving the quality of education. Although access is, I would say close to 100%, is never 100%, but there are some here and there gaps. The issue is about quality and how you raise quality, especially empowering teachers that actually can stand, the pace of also how the new generation are moving forward very, very quickly. I'm sure that you might get bored in class sometime if your teacher knows maybe less than what you know through the internet and so on, and I'm sure you are challenging your teachers more than once. So the opportunities to give teachers to be trained continuously on the job is extremely important. So we help the Ministry of Education to put in place actually policies and strategy to improve their teacher training approach, and also to improve their curricula. We're also helping them to adopt a policy that is an inclusive policy. So, and what we call inclusive education. So where we address, as I said, people with different languages, but also people that have, for example, disability, how to mainstream them in school. To talk about science, you might know that here in Qatar you have a huge natural reserve, which is under the auspices of UNESCO. It's part of a program that is called Man and the Biosphere Reserve, and the reserve is called Al-Rim. It's almost 1,000 square kilometers. It's huge. It goes, I'm sure that you know where the Richard Serra, statues are, up to Zubara. So we help the government in mapping the flora and fauna and also to managing it. To close, because I'm sure we have, I have to leave space to my other colleague. In terms of communication and information, together with George, we work a lot on freedom of expression. We have an MOU with Al Jazeera, so we work very closely with them. We work on safety of journalists, media literacy at school, how you can read actually the newspaper in class and understand the newspaper in class. And we have several of these programs in the schools here. And then another program that we have that also some schools are benefiting here in Qatar is to teach you how to develop mobile applications on different issues. So I would like to close here and to leave the space to other colleagues.
You have to close in 7 minutes.
Alright, so I promise I will be very quick, and I'm going to start on a personal note, because I have been where all of you are, and I did Model UN when I was your age, and it was the most wonderful thing I've ever done. So I congratulate all of you for doing it, because I think it's absolutely fantastic. And I was Papua New Guinea, and it was still really fun. So my name's Margaret, and I'm an advisor to Dr. Ahmed El Meraiki. He's a Qatari, and he was appointed on December 8th to be the humanitarian envoy to the Secretary General of the UN. So he works directly with the heads of agencies, and his role is to bring Qatar closer to the UN and to engage more on humanitarian fronts. So a lot of what we do is not looking internally into Qatar, but looking to bring Qatar closer to the multilateral system. So bringing Qatar in terms of whether it's financing, whether it's developing foreign aid policies. We work a lot with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and doing joint initiatives with other countries, with a lot of the ambassadors and the embassies here in Qatar. That's basically what we do. One of the biggest things that he did when he started was the Halal Labay campaign. Last year in Qatar, His Highness the Emir canceled the National Day, which is a pretty big thing. Millions of dollars had been spent, and in canceling it out of solidarity with the people of Aleppo, of Halab, he had said, all of that money we're going to have a fundraising campaign, and all of the money raised is going to go to Halab, to Aleppo. And Dr. Al-Mareki was instrumental in ensuring that money was going through the multilateral system to ensure, the multilateral system, I mean, I'm sure you know, is the UN, and it's the donor countries that all work within plans that respond to humanitarian needs. And in order to save time, just because I think it'll be better if we get questions from you, because of this, he became very interested in the conflict in Syria, and we did a field mission to Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. And during that, one of the things that moved Dr. Al-Mareki was his interactions with the children. And he is now a No Lost Generation champion, which is a campaign for children as a result of the conflict in Syria, so mostly children in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, and the neighboring countries in Turkey, that these children have been grown up in a series of conflict for now more than 7 years. We're coming up on the 8th year of the conflict. And his role is to try and advocate that there shouldn't be a lost generation of children, that they should be able to go to school, that they should be able to avail themselves of all of the great things that these agencies are doing. And so that's one of his things. And in New York in September, the General Assembly, he attended an event, and during the event there was a high-level panel, and he was not on the panel, he was in the audience just there to show his support. And they had children who were video linked in from Idlib. And he is one of the highest level Arabic speakers in the Secretariat for the UN. And he was able to interact with these kids in a way that a lot of other people couldn't. So he spent about 45 minutes talking to children. And I'm going to show you one of the videos that he did. This is a video of a girl named Bana. She's 9 years old, and she had asked a question to the panel saying, you know, I want to be a dentist when I grow up. How can you guys, sitting in New York, having all these diplomatic meetings, help me? Unfortunately, because of airstrikes that were happening, she had to go down into the caves below where she was living, and she never got to see the answer from the panel. So what we did was we had a video link set up between her and Dr. Al-Mareki, and it's only a minute long, and then we'll open it up to questions. But I want to show you this video.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أهلا يا أبو أحمد، كيفك؟
على الفيديو اليوم وفرحنا بالطلة الجميلة من عندك، وهذه ردت الرسالة ان اليوم اصلا احنا مجتمعين هنا في نيويورك علشانك انت وعلشان اخواتك وزملاتك.
أنا قاعدة هلا في الجامعة بس بطلع لفوق لأنه الطيران هلا عنا شغال. نحن ما بدنا اجتماعات وحكي، بدنا فرد.
ان احنا كيف ممكن نقدم لكم الخدمات اللي ممكن ترقى فيكم، وكيف ممكن ان احنا ندعو الدول كلها كافة، خاصة ان احنا مجتمعين اليوم في نيويورك والدول كلها موجودة. هذه فرصة أن احنا ندعو الدول أنها كلها تتكاتف في خدمتكم بحيث أن أنتم تحصلون أعلى خدمة في التعليم، وأن أنتم تحققون طموحاتكم اللي كلنا نتمنى أن أنتم تحققونها. وبيجي اليوم إن شاء الله اللي نلتقي فيه تقولي لي نعم أنا حققت الطموح اللي أنا أبيه، وإن شاء الله نشوفك على خير.
أم أحمد إن شاء الله بس نحقق حلمك ومساعدتك ودعمك.
I know we're probably rushing to get out of here, but if I'm sure there's time for at least one, not two questions. Is there a microphone around?
So I'd like to ask a question about the anti-corruption department. When you talked about corruption, so I heard that Singapore is one of the countries where the corruption is the least, and where there isn't any corruption because of the fact that deputies and politicians are paid a very high salary. What could you say about that? Do you think there's another solution against the corruption? And do you think this is an effective method to fight against corruption?
Well, thanks for the great question. And I'm sure you've probably seen that there's an NGO called Transparency International, which puts out an index every year of sort of the most to the least corrupt countries. And as part of my work with the UN, we don't actually rank countries in terms of their status, and we're really just trying to help everyone end up with a more lawful culture. In terms of whether or not having well-paid professional diplomats and government workers and teachers and doctors, I think it's a really important way to prevent corruption. Mostly because a lot of people associate corruption with bribery, right? And so bribery can be everything from you taking some money to do something that you are already supposed to be doing, or taking some money to do something that you're not supposed to be doing. And for a lot of people around the world who are providing services, whether they be doctors or police officers or people in the government, one of the reasons that they end up taking bribes is because they don't have other means to do basic things like feed their families. So it's certainly one way that we can look at, but a lot of countries don't necessarily have the same resources that Singapore does to be able to ensure that. So one of the things we're really focusing on a lot is prevention efforts and how we can actually bring more integrity and transparency and accountability into governments and public sector services so that we can start stamping out those kind of things. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much.
Hello. I just wanted to ask, many people think that the United Nations doesn't do much. So, for you, what is the most important thing that you change?
I'm so sorry, can you just repeat that, the last bit?
What is the most important thing that the United Nations change in the world?
So I'm just going to answer on a very individual level, and that video is what we changed, is what my boss changed. He spoke to Vanna, and she now has hope, which prior, one of his big things is trying to give people hope and trying to show that the UN and its partners, and all the donor countries and the countries that are working really hard in places like Syria and the neighboring countries with the conflict, that they can provide people with hope in very dire situations. So for on a very, very personal level, that is what we feel we've changed. Because what we do is at a very high, very strategic level. I think you guys will have much more concrete
Well, I would say, because everybody, all the colleagues talk, and even Margaret now, it's about education. It's giving you the possibility, like Anna, like everybody, really to meet your aspirations. And the first step in doing that is really providing you with a solid education that matches then your aspiration to become something in life. And, you know, we contributed a lot of agencies. I mean, you have heard all of us. I mean, we all contribute to the process of education in a different way in our field of competence. So I think all the agencies had the component to bring forward to the education system. In the case of my agency, we look at the comprehensive, you know, the policy and planning and how to set the mechanism in place. And then you have other agencies that are more on the ground delivering at this, whether UNICEF or UNHCR in refugees camps or so on. I would say that this is what changed tremendously.
To add also to my colleagues that sometimes people mix between the UN. You cannot put the whole UN in one basket. You have the charter-based organizations and the agencies, funds and programs. The charter-based organizations, they are like the Security Council, the United Nations General Assembly or the Human Rights Council, which all depends on member states. Unfortunately, because it is more political, you see it has always some consequences. But while the other, like the UNESCO, UNICEF, UNODC, OHCHR, and UNDP, all the other agencies, OCHA that provides humanitarian assistance, I think they do their best to be closer to people in need and try to serve the most vulnerable groups in the world. But what we are witnessing nowadays in the whole, especially in our region, there is like a complete collapse of the whole values and principles that we all learned that after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was based on, like dignity, freedom, justice, peace, solidarity, etc. All these values are collapsing in front of our eyes, and we are seeing hatred, killing and slaughtering, violence, conflict, and civilian people, especially women and children and other groups, are bearing the brunt of these conflicts. And unfortunately, the need is very high. And even for all the UN and all the humanitarian agencies and all agencies that are willing to support are unable to fulfill the needs. Because the global powers are investing more in armed industry and bringing more weapons to our region instead of assisting our people to invest in education, health, and real development. Thank you.
I hate to do this, but dinner is going to be served in 10 minutes, and there's only one thing worse than having to cut short a really interesting presentation. I think you can tell from the interest here and by the fact that many of you, it's okay, we can be honest, are kind of MUN geeks. This is all very, very interesting things that you're talking about, and this is an audience that certainly appreciates that. There's only one thing worse, and that is hundreds of very hungry teenagers, and I have to be mindful that we don't create an international incident as we all rush to the conference hall for dinner. This was a first, and again, it's really hard to get very busy people all to kind of drop everything and be at one place at one time. I'm very, very grateful to all of you that you've made this time. I hope we can have you back again, have you engaged in other TQ events, and if you're ever looking for a pool of really interested, dynamic, and engaged young people, I have a couple thousand of them that would love to engage with you. So please, folks, let's give them a round of applause. Here's how dinner works, okay? In 10 minutes, we kind of need to be in the conference room, grab a chair, they're serving drinks and cola right now, get something to drink.